Everybody loves a good story. Even if you're quadriplegic physicist, you still love a good story. And so Stephen Hawking, who has taken the position that was once held by Einstein as the most highly regarded physicist in the world, although he is quadriplegic and can communicate only through electronic devices, he has a brilliant mind. And with that brilliant mind, he wanted to tell the story of physics to everyday people. And so he linked up with the scriptwriter from Star Trek. So you get the best of both universes, if you will. You have the genius and the intelligence of Hawking, and you have the ability to put zingers in there and tell a story in a way that's really interesting. So the book is called The Grand Design. And we read that for the School of Religion book club not too long ago. And in this book, Hawking develops a fascinating thesis. His thesis is that the universe, the entire universe as we know it, all those galaxies, all of those nebulae off into illimitable space, if you will, that entire universe was uniquely shaped for the survival of human beings. You say, who came up with a cockamamie idea like that? Well, the Einstein of the 21st century, that's all. So you got to take him seriously, even if you find the idea at first blush a little bit much. For example, the interior of the sun is about 40,000 degrees Fahrenheit. If it were just a few degrees more, we would be toast, literally. And if it were a few degrees less, it would be way too cold on this planet. If the Earth, in its orbit, were a few million miles closer to the sun, it would not be good. Or a few million miles further, it would not be good. If the orbit was not nearly round, but was elliptical, as so many planets are, it would be too hot in the summer and too cold in the winter. It just wouldn't work. And he goes on for about 11 different major calculations, including physics calculations that I couldn't even explain to you, although he did a good job of telling it with his scriptwriter friend. And so basically he came to the conclusion, when you look at all the deeper levels of physics, the universe, the entire universe, has to be exactly the way it is, or human life on this earth would not survive. That sounds like the grand design. Now you ask, why is Hawking an atheist? And how can he explain the universe as it is as an atheist? Well, he has a very interesting way of doing so. After describing this grand design, he then says, what are the chances that the universe could have just happened like this? Total accident. That the universe is just the way it is, that the laws of physics are just the way they are, that human beings can be here on this planet and survive. He says the chances are 1 in 10 to the 522nd. Now, for those of you who aren't into science, that's 1 followed by 522 zeros. 1 chance in 1 to 522 zeros. How much of a chance is that? Not good. Hey, if you guys were interested in a girl, and you said to her, what are the chances? And she says, oh, about 1 in 522 zeros. So you're saying there's a chance? You know. I don't think so, really. That's not going to work out too well, you see. So what is Hawking's answer? How could this universe be here just by chance? And he says, there must be 1 in 522 zeros universes, just like this one. each of them with its own laws, each of them by chance, maybe with its own creatures, etc. Now, if you find that to be a bit of a stretch, even for a physicist, I've got a big story that's even better. It's the story in the book of Revelation. It's the grand story that explains everything. You see, what Hawking was looking for is what he called the grand unifying theory, the theory of everything, the theory of physics that would explain everything that exists. And he can do it as well as anyone. But Seventh-day Adventists have discovered in the Bible a grand unifying theory that I think is way more appealing than Hawking's theory. And we call it the cosmic conflict, or the great controversy. And we'll study the crucial text today, Revelation 12. And you say, where's your Bible? Well, I have the JP translation right here. Okay? Because it's my job to work with the Greek and the Hebrew and all that kind of stuff. So I took the trouble of translating Revelation 12. And if you're interested in my translation of the book of Revelation, you can go to the website, thebattleofarmageddon.com. That's one word, thebattleofarmageddon.com. And if you go to that website and you click on the link that says Revelation Translation, that'll be my translation. So you can find it there. But for this morning, I will share it with you, and I invite you to look up the text in your own version. Revelation 12 tells the biggest story ever told. It's about a war, a big battle, a cosmic battle, like Star Trek. Good against evil, Christ against Satan. And the focus of the story is on a piece of that battle, particularly because, you see, on this earth, we are part of this bigger story. All the little stories that people tell are part of a bigger, much bigger story. And the stories of battles, the stories of action, the stories of heroes, the stories of good against evil, we love those stories. And we love to see them told over and over in different forms, because every one of us is part of a much bigger story. And maybe the question we should all be asking ourselves is, what story have I fallen into? What story is my life designed to tell? Well, when you get to Revelation 12, there's three key characters in the story. And one of the things I think we don't always do with the book of Revelation is actually look at the story. Because sometimes we take a symbol in the text, well, that's this nation in history, or that's that person in history, and we start jumping from the text to history, and we miss the story. The history is very important. But if you miss the story, you may miss something that's really, really important. So I'd like today to look at the story, to tell the story of Revelation 12. And before we do that, let me give you a secret. Okay? Before we get into the story, sometimes when a film opens up telling a story, the voiceover comes in, right? Remember Lord of the Rings? You know, the voiceover comes in telling the background so that when you get into the story, you're not totally lost. Well, here's the background to this story. In the book of Revelation, whenever a new character appears, some new character in the story, whenever that new character appears, there's like a freeze frame. The story stops, and a voiceover comes in and does two things. Number one, it describes the new character physically. What the character looks like, how the character is dressed, and then it tells us a little bit about that character's past. You know, this is Uncle John, and he was a thief and a liar. Okay, now you know how Uncle John's going to play in the story. And that's the background you needed to know to understand this character. Well, in the book of Revelation, whenever a new character appears, you get that visual description, and then you get a little bit of that character's background. Now, you notice that the characters in the book of Revelation are strange. I mean, one of them has 7 heads and 10 horns. See any of those out in the forest lately? I hope you haven't, because I'd know you were drinking. All right, so no. Book of Revelation doesn't have animals that are like the animals we know at the zoo, okay? No zoo animals there. These are really, really strange. So is the book of Revelation an animal story? Not really. These animals, it's a fantasy, like a cartoon fantasy designed to teach us something about ourselves. There's an analogy of that in the film world, and that's the cartoon called Lion King. Do any of you remember that? Was that an animal story? Not really. Not really. It was about lions and tigers and bears, and all that kind of stuff. But actually, it was really about people and about groups of people and how they relate to each other. It's actually an African apocalypse. I had a chance to travel to the place that was described in that film. It's called Masai Mara in southern Kenya, and it also extends into northern Tanzania. And that story uses a perfect world, the corruption of a perfect world, and the redemption of that world through a son. And you see the larger picture of the great story of the book of Revelation. So the book of Revelation is actually a cartoon fantasy. And it really makes sense in today's world because we know those kind of stories. We're not surprised by those stories. So let's get into it. 3 characters. Revelation 12 and verse 1. It says, "A great sign was seen in heaven, a woman dressed with the sun. The moon was under her feet, and upon her head was a victory crown of 12 stars." Okay. Obviously, you haven't seen anybody like that lately, have you? I don't know what it means to be dressed with the sun, to stand on the moon, to have stars in your head. That would be kind of hot, I would think, But it's a fantasy, you see? It's not supposed to be like real life. It is the author's imagination, and I would see the author as Jesus Christ. It's the author's imagination to tell a story so that we can learn something that's really critical, and that's our mission today, to know the story and find out what is the key message that we need to take away. So you have this woman, this strange and unusual woman, dressed with the sun, standing on the moon, crown of stars on her heads. She was pregnant. See, that's the visual description. Now we get the history. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she labored to give birth. So here's what you need to know about the woman. She's pregnant. She's about to give birth to a baby. All right? That's the hint. Follow the story. New character shows up. Verse 3. "Another sign was seen in heaven, a great fiery red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and upon his heads 7 crowns." All right, bad guy. This is the bad guy for sure. We know who the heroine is. Here comes the bad guy. His tail, here comes a little bit of his history, the setting, the voiceover. His tail dragged down 1/3 of the stars of heaven and threw them to the earth. The dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth in order that when her child was born, he might eat it up. Uh-oh. This is not a comedy. This is a tragic story. This is suspense. This is a drama. There's going to be a baby born, and that baby is in jeopardy right from the moment of birth. And so the horror music begins coming in the background of the story. You begin to realize this may not turn out well at all. Are you into the story yet? Verse 5. "And she gave birth to a son, a male child, who is about to shepherd all the nations with a rod of iron, and her child was snatched up to God and to his throne." I forgot to tell you one thing. Not every character in the book of Revelation has a description and a background. Whenever a character isn't described visually, doesn't have that background, it's because that character has appeared already in the story somewhere before. So here we have a new character, a male child, but this male child is not a new character. Even though it's the first time he's mentioned in the story here, he's not a new character. He's been there before, and I'm going to let you in on something because it will help us to tell the story. This character is going to be Jesus Christ. He appeared back in chapter 1 as, first of all, as Jesus Christ, and then as the Son of Man, the glorious Son of Man, and later as the Lamb that was slain. He appears in many different forms in the story. So you have Jesus Christ, you have a dragon, and you have a woman. And what happens to this male child? He escapes. He escapes the dragon because he is snatched up to heaven. It's like a giant vacuum hose, comes down out of heaven. That's the word that's used right here. He's sucked up to heaven, just snatched right up there. He's rescued. Doesn't say by who, but he is rescued from the dragon. The dragon is not able to accomplish his purpose with that male child. So here's where we are. You have three characters in the story. You have Jesus, you have Satan, and you have the woman. And those three are going to be critical to the story. Now, early readers of the book saw a specific historical event in the story. Any idea what it is? Herod and the babies of Bethlehem. Remember that part of the story? Herod was afraid of this baby that was going to be born. He decided to destroy that baby, and what did he do? He went about it by destroying all the babies in Bethlehem, but he missed the very one that he was aiming at. So, many readers of the story would see echoes of Bethlehem, echoes of Herod, echoes of the terrible tragedy that occurred at that time. But let's not be too tempted to go off into history because we might miss the story. So let's stay with the story and let's ask the question, where did these three characters go? Well, we already know the male child was snatched up into heaven. Where does the woman go? Verse 6. It says, and the woman fled into the desert, where she has a place prepared for her by God, in order that she might be nourished there for 1,260 days. So the woman did what any intelligent person would do. You see a dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns? Run! Get out of there. All right? So she takes off into the desert, and unfortunately we can't follow her. All right? That's not the part of the story that we have time for this morning. But she goes off into the desert, and the story will continue with her later. But where does the dragon go? Verse 7. And war burst forth in heaven. Michael and his angels gathered to fight against the dragon, and the dragon and his angels also fought. And so the dragon now shows up in heaven, and war takes place up there. Now there's a new character appears again, and it's Michael. It's the first time that name appears here. But there's no visual description. There's no history. So what do you know? Michael's been in the story before. The male child disappears. He's snatched up to heaven, but you never see him there. Why? Because he is Michael. And we see in verse 10, he's Jesus Christ. So the male child goes up to heaven, and when the male child goes up to heaven at the ascension of Jesus, war breaks out in heaven. And the dragon and the male child are fighting in heaven. Verse 8. And the dragon was not strong enough, neither was a place found in heaven for them. And now we find out something more about the dragon And the great dragon was thrown down, the ancient serpent, the one called the devil and Satan, who deceives the whole inhabited world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. So now we know who the dragon is. It's not just Herod. It's not just Rome. The dragon goes deeper. Who is the dragon? He's the ancient serpent. Who's that? Garden of Eden. He's the devil. He's Satan. All words that are used in the Old Testament of the great adversary of God, and in the New Testament of Jesus Christ. So the dragon up in heaven is Satan, and he is also the serpent that was here on earth in the Garden of Eden. What was the serpent doing in the Garden of Eden? What was his mission there? To tell lies about God. To tell lies about God. So now we're beginning to catch the significance of this story. It's military language. It's about wars. It's about battles. It's about action. But there's something else going on. Because this dragon is not just a military commander. This dragon is one who tells lies about God. And notice verses 10 through 12 that continue the story. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, "Now have come the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ. For the accuser of our brothers, the one who accuses them before the throne of God day and night, has been thrown down. And they overcame him by the blood of the Lamb and the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives unto death. For this reason rejoice, heavens and those who live in them. Woe to the earth and the sea, because the devil has come down to you in great rage, knowing he has only a little time." So here we see Jesus Christ appears again without introduction. So the male child, Michael, Jesus Christ, are three ways of describing one actual person that the story is talking about. Jesus Christ, in verse 10, what happens to him? He receives the throne. He receives the kingdom. Now, why is that important? Because when Adam sinned in the Garden of Eden, he gave up his rulership of this earth to Satan. And now, because of the cross of Jesus Christ, Jesus reclaims the throne. And in verse 10, it says, now, when is now? When the dragon is thrown down. Now, when the dragon is thrown down, have come the salvation, the power, and the kingdom of our God, and the authority of his Christ. That reminds us of chapter 5 in Revelation, where the Lamb is seated on the throne of God. And the entire creation sings, "Worthy is the Lamb that was slain to receive power and throne and kingdom and glory," and all the rest of that. So Jesus Christ was enthroned in heaven upon his ascension to heaven. The cross, the ascension, the enthronement of Christ. That's what's happening here in chapter 12. So the dragon is thrown down when Jesus is set up. Because of the cross, Jesus now has reclaimed his rightful throne, reclaimed his rightful rulership over this earth, and the dragon is cast down from that position. Now, that raises a bit of a question, at least in Adventist minds. I thought this war in heaven was way back before creation. What's going on here? Well, you see, there's what literary people would call a double stage going on here. A double stage is when a story splits and goes in two different directions. You have a double stage with the woman waiting out there in the wilderness. The story takes her out into the wilderness and gives a length of time that she's going to stay out there. So, okay, we know where she is. We know what she's doing. We leave her and we go to the other stage of the story, which is up in heaven, the war that's taking place in heaven. So that's a double stage in place. But there's also a double stage in time. Because if you remember in verse 4, what did it say in verse 4? The dragon dragged a third of the stars out of heaven. Stars earlier in the book of Revelation represent angels. So the dragon was in heaven when? Before the birth of the child. Before the birth of the child, he was in heaven and took down a third of the angels with him. So there was a war in heaven before the child is born, and there's a war in heaven after the child ascends to heaven. So you see, within the time frame of the story, there's a double stage time-wise. There's actually two battles in heaven. And if you go back to verse 7, the translation that I read to you, based on the Greek language, is, and war burst forth in heaven. The way that that is described, it indicates that the language there, while it applies to the time of Jesus' ascension, that language echoes back to an earlier war. And you say, when did that war take place? How far back does this battle go? In Revelation 13:8, it tells us the Lamb was slain from the foundation of the world. And the word world there in Greek is cosmos, from the foundation of the universe. Before creation, there was a war in heaven. Before creation, there was a cross, anticipating the cross that was here on earth. The Lamb made the decision to go to the cross already before creation. The cross of Jesus Christ, as we saw last night, is not just about us here on this earth. The cross of Jesus Christ is a cosmic cross. The cross of Jesus Christ affects the entire universe. And so you have a double stage in time. The dragon was cast out of heaven before creation. He was cast out of innocence. But after the cross, he's cast out of influence. You see, what is the role of the dragon and Satan in this story? Go back to verse 10. What is he called there? The accuser of the brothers. He is cast down in chapter 12:10 as the accuser of the brothers. He was cast out in the beginning from his residency in heaven. But he continued to have a visitor's pass. Now, how do we know that? Book of Job. In the book of Job, God is sitting on his throne, and he calls a council of all the heads of planets around the universe. It was the original House of Congress. And Satan shows up at the council. What right does he have to show up? He says, well, Adam gave dominion to me. So it isn't only now that the House of Congress is dysfunctional. It was true way back then. With Satan in there, things had to go wrong, you see. And what is going on when Satan shows up at the council? What is he doing? He is accusing Job. Oh, Job serves you just because you give him all those goodies. You're the vending machine God, and who wouldn't serve you for that? But let me have charge of him. Take away all those goodies, and he'll curse you to your face. What was the real accusation here? God was being accused by Satan. You're not managing the universe right. Your people only serve you because of the good things they get from you. They don't really care. They don't really love you. They don't really trust you. They just serve you for what they can get. What kind of war is this? It's not tanks. It's not planes. Satan in this war, he's not saying, are the F-16s ready? Where's the Abrams tanks? We got to have everything for this battle. This is going to be a tough one. No. The language is military, but it's metaphorical language. The real war here is a war of words. You say, show me in the text. We can start with the tail of the dragon. When you go back in the Old Testament and see what tail symbolizes. I mean, we don't believe, do we, that a literal dragon dragged literal stars out of heaven? No. It's a story. It's a fantasy. And in the story, the tail of the dragon, according to its meaning as a symbol in apocalyptic stories, the tail of the dragon is lies. It's a prophet telling lies. Isaiah 9:15. So the dragon stars out of heaven. Sorry. The dragon stars out of heaven is doing so by words, by persuasion, by lies. And in verse 9, it tells us that he is the echo of the serpent in the Garden of Eden who tells lies. In chapter 10, he's the accuser of the brethren. And in verse 11, how do they overcome him? Through the word of their testimony. Do you see? It's a war of words. The great controversy, the greatest battle ever fought, is a war of words. And what are the weapons in those wars? If you look on God's side, the weapons are blood, the word of testimony, and self-sacrifice. They loved their lives, not so much to avoid death. They would be willing, they would serve God even if it meant their death. So, the weapons on God's side are testimony. They are self-sacrifice. They are blood. What are the weapons on Satan's side? Deception, accusation. It's a battle over the character of God. It's a battle over what God is like. You see, you overcome how? Verse 11. By the blood of the Lamb, through the cross, by the word of their testimony, and they did not love their lives even unto death. The redeemed are those who trust God even though they die in the process. And Job was the model for that kind of trust. Job questioned. Job didn't know everything that was going on. Even when God comes down and talks to him, he doesn't tell him exactly why he's suffering. So we will never know in this life the full story of why people suffer if God is good. But Job trusted God. God says to him later, you spoke rightly about me. You said the right things about me. And what Job was all about is trusting God even though he didn't have a good life, even though he was suffering, even though he didn't understand. You see, trust is what it's all about. Trusting in God is what Job did. And trust cannot be forced. Trust requires freedom. You have to be able to choose in order to trust. And when God created human beings, He gave us the power of choice. Now, just imagine that God was different. Just imagine that God was a God of force, that God did not want anything to escape His control. Because realize, when God creates free beings, what is He doing? He's giving up control. We love control. We like everybody around us to behave just the way we're comfortable, right? God was not like that. He could have. He could have created us all robots, you know? And if we were all robots, we would love Him forever. I love you with all my silicone, you know? How great would that be? Not very. None of you guys would want to date a robot, right? Not good. Because you know that no matter what that machine says, it doesn't really love you. It doesn't have a choice. Love only matters when it's chosen. When somebody chooses you, that is a beautiful thing. You see? And God created free beings as He wanted the universe to be a place of love, and love can only happen when it's freely given. And trust needs to be freely given. Now imagine if Satan, in the beginning, began to accuse God, and he went up to another angel, okay, and we're going to call the angel Charlebert. You know, angels are supposed to have different kind of names, all right? So Charlebert, he goes up to Charlebert and he says, hey, listen, I don't think God is quite what he's making himself out to be. I don't think God can be trusted. I think he's mean. I think he's a tyrant. I think if you say one word against him, he's just going to snuff you out like a bug. And Charlebert says, no, God wouldn't be like that. And Satan says, oh yeah, he is. And just at that moment, lightning bolt comes out of the sky. Satan is fried on the spot and just evaporates. What is Charlebert going to think? Well, maybe he was right. He goes up to his friend. He says, you're not going to believe what I just saw. Lucifer came over to me, and he was saying that God isn't everything quite that we've made him out to be, that God is not kind and loving, that God is brutal, he's judgmental, and if you say anything against him, you're going to get fried. And just at that point, a lightning bolt comes from heaven, and Charlebert is vaporized on the spot. Wouldn't take too many events like that, and what would happen? Everybody would serve God faithfully out of fear, looking for lightning bolts. You see? Now, I had a really good mom. She raised me to love and serve the Lord, and she was one of the kindest people I've ever known. She was always doing stuff for others. And at her funeral, the text was taken from Mark 14:8. She has done what she could. She had a third-grade education. She never, did big things in this world. She just served. She was beautiful. But even the best of mothers have a bad day. I remember one day it was a vicious thunderstorm, really bad. I mean, lightning crashing, thunder rolling. I was about 6 years old, and I was in my usual spot in thunderstorms. I was on the floor of my closet, cowering from all of that noise and lightning and so on. My mom came into the room, and I said, Mom, why does it have to be like this? I don't know what was going on in her life that day, but she just tossed this over her shoulder. I doubt she ever remembered it. But she just says, well, God is angry with those people who are breaking his commandments. I imagine she meant well. She thought, now that'll make sure he's going to obey the commandments. But I knew I'd broken some. And I thought the next lightning bolt was coming for me. Now, is that the kind of faithful service God is looking for? That is a view that people have of God. But if that was the kind of God there was, Lucifer wouldn't have made it out of heaven. God wouldn't have offered him a golden parachute. He'd have offered him a kick in the seat and a lightning bolt and a few other things. You see, it reminds me of Mickey Mouse. No, not the Disney one. The one in my house. You see, it was about 10 years ago when the doorbell rang, and it was a lady who lived across the street. She lived in Chicago, but she'd come on weekends. She had a house across the street. And apparently there was a cat that got up in her tree, and it took her a couple days to get it down. And the cat was a real mess and frightened and everything else. And she brought the cat over, and she says, I can't deal with the cat right now. Would you take it for a couple of days? I have to go to Chicago. When I come back, I will find a home for her. Okay? Of course, you know what happened. We already had 2 cats. We didn't need 3. My wife fell in love with her in a couple of days. We can't give her back. I said, yeah, right, I know. So she named it Mickey Mouse. And Mickey Mouse, I don't know what her parentage was. It must not have been very good. The colors were all wrong. There was a spot on the nose, but it wasn't centered. It's kind of off to the side. And it looked kind of like it was a white cat that, sniffed a pile of dust and then rolled over in it once, and there she is, black and white. Not very pretty, but the most tragic thing about Mickey is I don't know what her life was like before she came to us, but to this day, if you pick her up, she begins shaking and quite. She's scared to death of those gods, those big people. I don't know what happened to her, but it's so sad. Her view of us is something to be afraid of, and it will never change. It is so deeply ingrained on her. Here's the key to this whole thing. You become like the God you worship. You may have noticed that on the sign out front. You become like the God you worship. If, like Mickey, you believe that the God in your life is arbitrary, judgmental, severe, watching for every mistake to squash you like a bug, then you will serve God out of fear. But something even worse will happen to you. You will become like the God you worship. You will become arbitrary, severe, judgmental, critical. Because that is your picture of God. On the other hand, if the God that you serve is gracious and kind and forgiving, you become like that. A fascinating thing is recent brain studies. Psychology has been around for a long time, but people just talk, But now there's actual science behind psychology. You can take scans of the brain, and you can see the brain change in different therapies. And it's fascinating. You can see damage to the brain. There's physical damage that comes in the brain when people view God as judgmental and arbitrary and unkind and critical. When people have that kind of view of God, it changes the brain in negative ways. When people believe in a God who is gracious and kind, like Jesus was, it actually brings about physical changes in the brain that are positive. You become like the God you worship. And the good news of this is as we come to see God through the lens of Jesus Christ, it will change us. We can become like Him. Ellen White says, it would be well if we spent a thoughtful hour each day contemplating the life of Christ, especially the closing scenes, especially the cross. Because there we see the clearest picture of what God is like. Rather than being God that is violent and judgmental, we see a God that would allow human beings to nail Him up on a cross. What is God really like? Jesus said in the Gospel of John, if you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Now bring that home to Revelation 12. What is the essence of Satan in chapter 12? If you were to describe Satan in one sentence, what is his bad act? He is the accuser of the brothers. If God is the opposite of Satan, what does that make him? Could it be the encourager of the brothers and the sisters and everybody else? If the key characteristic of Satan is that he is the accuser of the brothers, it implies to me that the key characteristic of God in this story is the encourager of the brothers. And if so, what are the implications for the way we treat other people, for the way we treat each other? When we are gracious, when we are kind, when we're forgiving, when we don't keep score of wrongs, we become like the God we worship. We speak well of God by our actions. But when we are tempted to criticize, to judge, and accuse in the name of God, now that's the key. Everybody does some judging and accusing. But one of the tragedies in the church is that we accuse in the name of God. And when we do that, we are describing to people what God is like. When we're tempted to criticize, judge, and accuse in the name of God, are we unwittingly taking on the spirit and the character of Satan? We may feel the end justifies the means, but when we exhibit the character of Satan in our work for God, are we not speaking badly of God's reputation? Are we not portraying a picture of what God is like that undermines His reputation? Because what is God really like? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. Jesus is no different than the Father would have been if the Father had come and died on the cross instead. The picture we see of Jesus is what God is really like. After the first service, a sister came to me and said, "You know, I appreciate what you said, but aren't there times when we need to judge other people? Aren't there times when we need to set things right?" And I say, well, Jesus did that, you're right. Prophets did that. They were inspired. They knew the whole story. How often do we know the whole story before we open our mouths? You see? I would say there are times to call sin by its right name, but you'd better be sure you know the right name before you do it, because the risk that we take whenever we accuse or whenever we call sin by its right name, as we like to, the risk that we take is we're speaking badly about what God is like. Because if in our accusations there is one drop of injustice in it, the person will impute all of that to God. What is God like? If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. He is not the accuser of the brothers and the sisters. God is the encourager of the brothers and the sisters. And when we speak well of Him, we speak words of encouragement to each other, words of faith and hope and grace and kindness. And when we do that, we become like the God we worship. And I know I've gone long, but let me share something that's not in the script. In James 2:13, I don't even have the text with me, but in James 2:13, it sort of puts the final piece in this puzzle. It says there that in the judgment, there will be no mercy for who? The one who had no mercy. And what that tells me is God allows us, in a sense, to set the standard for our own judgment. There'll be no mercy for the one who had no mercy. That means there will be mercy for those who had mercy. Mercy to the merciful. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall what? Obtain mercy. That just struck home so deep to me. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not a person who has overcome this 100% by any means. I'm tempted as much as anyone else to speak badly of others. But it struck me so strong that when we judge others, we're setting the standard for our own judgment. And if for no other reason but a selfish one, be kind, be merciful, be gracious. But the best reason of all is because that is what God is like. And when we are kind, when we are gracious, and when we are merciful, we speak well of God. If you have seen me, you have seen the Father. I want to speak well of God.